money, and they just weren't very good kids, and they were also not very bright, and they entered into battle with the Philistines in the northern part of Israel and lost it. They took the Ark of the Covenant actually with them into the battle like a totem, and they lost the Ark. They lost the Ark, and they were killed in battle, and then when their father found out that the Ark had been lost, he fell dead. So a lot of death around the loss of the Ark of the Covenant. Y'all remember the Ark of the Covenant, right? You know what that is? It's that golden box. Half the book of Exodus is about what to do with the Ten Commandments, how to carry it around, very specific instructions, what kind of tent goes around it. The Talmud tells us that for 243 years, I think that's the date, but that's close enough, it sat in a tent at a place called Shiloh, and so once it was lost to Philistine cities who hot potatoed it around because all sorts of calamities happened to them while they had it. Of course calamities happened because we've seen the movie, right? Don't touch that thing. You remember Raiders of the Lost Ark? The guy's face melted off? Essentially, that's what happens, and so the Philistines can't wait to return it. They return it on the back of a cart, which is actually a miracle in itself because two milch cows, meaning a cow with a calf, are pulling it. And if you know anything about cattle and dairy, I don't. My friend Don does. He says that you cannot get a mama cow to leave her calf. And yet these two cows actually pulled a wagon in a straight line from the Philistine city of Ekron, who could not wait to get rid of the Ark of the Covenant, to this rock. So what happens during the COVID lockdown, archaeologists found what appeared to be a chapel and this rock, which is the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant in the city of Bet Shemesh. What we think, and because there's incense kind of burned there and also some sacrificial animal bowls nearby, what we think, they think, and what I think in turn, is that this is a little like a George Washington slept here kind of thing, that the ark moved on to a place called Kiryat Jearim, but while it was there, the fact that it was there, this rock became memorialized as a place where the Ark of the Covenant sat. Now, it's fascinating to me. I can't imagine they've done any extra work with it since October 7th of last year. So it's fascinating to me that this sits out under the weather across the street from a gas station in Bet Shemesh. I mean, people just moving on with their lives and living, but out here in a field is a place where the Ark of the Covenant rested. One day when this place is developed and we can take groups out there, although were y'all with me when you saw it? Right. It's now degraded to the point I can't take a group because you'd fall down in that hole. So we were a little risky taking y'all to see it because we don't have insurance for that. But it's you break a leg probably getting down to it right now. Once it is developed, it will be a national treasure. It will be a global treasure, quite frankly. Once it's developed, to have something that connects us to something such momentous. For those of you who just walked in, the Ark of the Covenant sat on that rock. And you can use deduction and the text to give a pretty strong hypothesis that that's true. Now, the reason why I begin with this picture is because once the Ark of the Covenant was returned, the tribes of Israel went into great rejoicing because they could be united again. It was the Ark of the Covenant that held them together. They didn't have a king in those days. I've got a timeline here, and I want to remind you that you can put the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, in a timeline and kind of find just about any story. So 2000 BC is the call of Abraham. That's really the beginning of everything. 1500 BC is the Egyptian captivity and then rescue, wanderings in Egypt. 1000 BC is King David when they asked for a monarch. Get to that in just a second. 900 BC is the division of their country into two places, like a civil war. You had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. 722 BC is the destruction of Israel in the north by the Mesopotamian superpower called Assyria, never to be found again. 586 is the Babylonian captivity of Judah. And then you can locate all the stories within these pivotal events. And so today, Samuel happens right here about 1100 BC. Which is the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, and is also a time when God's people were longing for something more stable than just a box, okay, and a tent, and judges to rule over them. There are two books of the Bible. We're teaching Bible Club right now, Joshua and Judges. They're about that time between 1500 and 1000 BC when tribal leaders would lead them. So when the Ark of the Covenant is returned to this place that you see right here on your screen, Samuel unites the tribes again and becomes the leader over them. He's a prophet. So he becomes the primary judge, if you will, over Israel. Now, this worked for a while. I mean, he's the one to hold it all together, but he's old. And his sons, much like Eli's own sons, don't have good leadership potential. They're not very good. They could see that it's not going to be a very stable government moving forward, like certain coaching staffs I'm aware of. It's just not stable like it used to be. I don't know. I'm just looking for an analogy somewhere. Okay, so as a result, Israel asked for a king. This is where I would begin my Samuel movie, is this heartbreak that Samuel has when Israel asks for a king. Why does Samuel not want Israel to have a king? Well, beginning in 2000 BC, God calls Abraham to leave a city and be different. He wants Abraham to be a different kind of man with a different kind of family, and through this difference, okay, the whole world would be blessed because Abraham would start a new humanity, or an example of a new humanity that we see played out even to this day. We are children of Abraham. We're those stars that he saw above his sky, in that we've been asked to be a different kind of human than the world around us, which would mean things like living by your appetites, or might makes right, or those who die with the most toys wins, or people or things, or whatever the way that the world is cranky and mean and cruel and indifferent, right? We are called to be lights in the world, if you will, God's hands and feet. And of course, through Jesus Christ's own life, death, and resurrection, we become those children as well. We become grafted on that vine that begins in 2000 BC. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we are in the timeline at 1100 BC, and God's people ask for a king. It's heartbreaking. Now, they want stability, and they want to have stability like their Canaanite neighbors. But you've heard me teach this class before. The reason why God's people are asked to be different is not because God doesn't love other people. Very good commentary I just read, Marilyn Robinson's Genesis. It's a good read if you like. Marilyn Robinson's a great writer anyway, but her commentary on Genesis is just great. It just reads like a story, and what she says is that the story, you see the stories of Abraham, and do y'all know some of the more obscure stories of Abraham where his wife Sarah's so beautiful that he tries to marry her off to the Egyptian king so that he doesn't get into trouble. It's not a really pretty story, and I'll spend some time with it at some point. But what Marilyn Robinson points out is that what God is teaching Abraham is that even Philistines or even Egyptians have a moral compass if they find it and they know it. God is not simply limited to the Hebrew people, but God has universal truths in all people, if you will. So one of these truths is justice. And there's a wordplay here when Samuel has a problem. He says, if you get a king, you'll forget justice. You'll forget my justice. And this word mishpat, justice, is used over 500 times in Scripture. And the way that it's interpreted here is when Samuel talks about the ways of the king. So let's read it. The ways of the king means the justice of the king. So Samuel, to begin our Samuel movie, begins with Samuel's speech. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 10. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who are asking him for a king. Begins the speech. These will be the ways of a king who will reign over you. Okay, so what he's saying is this is the justice of a king. You want a king? This is the justice of a king. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and be his horsemen, to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make implements of war and equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. There will be silence because this is the justice of the king. He's warning them that kings are just no good. They are no good, and I'll say some more about that. But what I love about this is you will cry out and the Lord will not answer, because the Lord will say, Sorry, you've got a king. Go to the king. It's a little like the movie Goodfellas. Does anybody remember Goodfellas? Paulie, you don't want Paulie to own your business, okay? Because Paulie will take, and then burn the restaurant. And this is what a king will do. They simply take and they take and they take and they take, and we're not different. They won't be different in the way that God asked them to be different. So how did this get started? How do we get here with Samuel being the leader of the nation, right, resisting their call for a king? By the way, they get a king, and I will go ahead and give you the punchline. We'll show how this happens. They get a king, and by the time you get to 900 B.C., the reason why the kingdom is split is because Solomon overtaxed them, overburdened them. He spent too much. He built a temple that God didn't ask for, and he overstretched them to the point that those living in the north said, we don't need this. These Judahites and Benjaminites in the south have got all the toys, and we're living far away. We want our own country. And so suddenly God's dream begins to sort of devolve into something that looks like government and war and humanity, right? And so how do we get to this place? Well, it begins with a family, and I want us to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2, which is page 214. Before I read it to you, I want to paraphrase a story. I've got another picture. Oh, wow, Rich, it looks like a pile of rocks. Well, it's an important pile of rocks. This is in Shiloh. It's in the middle of Shiloh, and this is actually the altar that Eli served in making sacrifices to God. So what would happen before they had a capital city in Jerusalem? That wouldn't happen until 1000 B.C. with King David. There was no Jerusalem now. But the tribes would travel to Shiloh, which is a place in what's now called the disputed West Bank. It's near where a lot of hot stuff is going on, near a place called Ramallah. But it's right in the middle, the West Bank of the Jordan River, in the north before you get to Galilee. It's on top of a mountain, and they would travel to it for the festivals. And we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 1 that a woman named Hannah, who was the second wife of a man named Elkanah, and his first wife Peninnah had lots of children, and Hannah had none. Now, barren women are a repeating theme in Scripture because I think the pain of it, especially for someone who longs for children, the pain of it seems to be emblematic of a deep longing of Israel. A longing for God, a longing for safety, a longing for dreams to come true, a longing for things to be right. And so this seems to come up again and again and again, and Hannah is certainly no exception. What she would do is go to this altar, this place that you're seeing right now, and she'd cry her eyes out every year for the festival. Now, as you know, we all have Jewish friends who can be very funny, and we know Jewish comedians are very funny. And there's a diorama here at Shiloh. I wish I could take you if it weren't in the middle of a war zone, but they have a movie. And so you go in the movie, and you sit in the diorama, and you choose English. You have to. It'll be like dubbed. They're speaking Hebrew, and they'll do English. And it's Elkanah and Peninnah and Hannah. And this is a paraphrase of what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 1, but the narrator says that Hannah cried because she had no children. And Elkanah goes, honey, I'm sorry, but you've got me. And I know, and it's actually pretty funny because he ain't no prize. And so he looks up at the camera, he goes, you got me. Wink, 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 wink. And you can just see everybody, regardless of language, family, or nation, laughing at the fact that Elkanah, this would be Elkanah's consolation, right? Oh, gosh, honey, you've got, stud muffin here. And so it is not. Hannah's just bereft. She's just bereft. And so the priest Eli sees her, and he hears her story, and he says, if you will give this child to God, then you will have a son, and it will all be well with you. And she does. She makes the promise, and she conceives, and she gives birth to Samuel. Now, I have my own personal story in this. When Ellen was pregnant with Copeland, she got real sick, and she had to have surgery during the pregnancy. And we were supposed to lose Copeland, and it wasn't going to end well. And we went to our church to pray in the chapel, which I encourage people to do all the time because it just meant so much to me. And our priest read the story of Hannah and said, if you promise to raise this child and give him to the Lord in your own way, we'll pray that Copeland will be okay. Now, I like to say that I gave him to Copeland and God gave him back. Oh, you can have him. But no, this is very important. It was very important to me to read Hannah's story here because I've got my own skin in this game, which is to say that we study these stories because we find out that if God did something for them, God will do it for us. If God did something for Hannah, God will do something for me. That we find our stories in these stories, and so she does have a child, and it's Samuel. And by the way, Hannah also will give birth to other children, so that Samuel's not her only child, and so her prayers are answered. Now, what she does is she sings, and I've got 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1. So when she has the little boy, this is what she says. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. The strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory." I'll keep reading. "There's no holy God like the Lord, no one beside you. There's no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him his actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low. He also exalts." I'll stop right there. Does that sound like anything you've heard before? Any of you old cradle Episcopalians from morning prayer, right one? It's the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, right? This is the Song of Mary. Actually, the Song of Hannah and the Song of Mary are the same length, same poetic twist, same topic, same song. Mary would sing this song 1,000 years later after Hannah. Now, I've got a couple of thoughts on this. One might say that whoever was remembering the story would remember that Mary was like Hannah in that she trusted the Lord and had a child, and naturally someone would think that Mary would either sing a song like Hannah, or the person writing the story would perhaps put those words into Mary's mouth. I don't think so. I think Mary knew the Song of Hannah because Mary was from a priestly family. Do you remember Mary was great with child? She's pregnant with baby Jesus. She goes to see her cousin Elizabeth, who lives in Jerusalem. Elizabeth is from a priestly family, and guys, those folks are well off. Elizabeth and John the Baptist, Zechariah, their daddy, lived in a gated community called Ein Karim. I could take you there today. They've got a Starbucks and nice hanging pots and a nice cobblestone street, and it's nice now, and it was nice then. And for Mary to come from a place like that, for her family to be from a place like that and grow up in Nazareth, which is 800 people tops, and it's a trailer park, and it's on top of a hill, and they don't have any land there, means that God chose not only a girl to save the world, but also a girl on her back heels. You don't move to Nazareth aspirationally. You don't leave there. And so what you've got in the Song of Mary and the Song of Hannah are two beat-up young women who are saying yes to God's promise and singing a song, and it's the same song. I'm trying to tell you that Mary could read in a world that we're probably she shouldn't be able to read, but because she was from a family that was literate and valued literacy. And we'll probably revisit this again closer to Christmas time. I just want you to understand that I think we probably undervalue Mary's earthly circumstance. I mean, the Queen of Heaven thing all is important, but just for God to entrust the story to her, right? And in a way, God's entrusting the story to Hannah as well, because God does through Hannah saying yes to the promise. Her son is the man who saves the nation. He saves them, right? The ark is returned, and he is the uniter of the tribes. But first, the boy Samuel has got to fulfill some prophecy. So here's the story that we come to next in our movie. So we start with a speech, then we go back to the beginning, and now we come to a voice in the night. Now, I said this earlier, but Eli has 2 ne'er-do-well sons, Phinehas and Hophni, and they're terrible. They steal from the sacrifices. They abuse people. They take too much money. They're just rounders. They're really, really bad kids. And poor Eli, he just lets them get away with, close to murder. And so he's got this little boy Samuel working in the temple with him, just like Hannah promised she would do. She's giving him to God. He wears a little linen ephod, which is a little priest robe, and he's like an acolyte, right? And so one night he keeps hearing a voice in the night. I think I'll read it and then we'll unpack it. So 1 Samuel 3 is found on page 215, beginning with the first verse. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And he said, Here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call. Lie down again. So he went to lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call. My son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again a third time. And he got up and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down. If he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And Samuel went down and lay in that place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. And then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make both the ears of anyone who hears it tingle. Now, we could keep reading and find out. What happens is that God tells Samuel that ill will befall Eli's family, the boys and the dad and the ark. And so Eli presses Samuel to tell him, and he does, and he says it's going to be lost and you're going to die. and Eli says, well, if this is of the Lord, then it'll happen. He's resigned to his fate. And that begins Samuel's career, really, even at a young age, as the prophet. So Samuel would lead the nation until the speech, which brings us back to our scene here. Let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1, page 218. So, let's see, it's on page 218, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. And his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Remember that justice word again? Maybe the key to being different in the way that God asks us to be different is just to be just, and then let the rest of it fall out. It's because we live in a very unjust world, and so there you go. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like the other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to govern us. So there we go, and then we're back to the speech. Well, here's the epilogue to the story of Samuel. Now I've given you some context. This is who the dude is. This is how he was born. This is what he was born to do. He was born to lead the nation. They asked for a king, and it breaks his heart. Okay, what happens? He anoints Saul. You want a king? We'll give you a king. Let me tell you about Saul. We've talked about Saul in past podcasts. Saul looks great on paper. Saul was born on third base, looks good in the uniform, rides tall in the saddle. He's handsome. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's got blue blood, everything you need for a royal family in Saul. And Saul is a disaster. There's a strange little story in 1 Samuel chapter 15. It's one of those Bronze Age tales that's a good illustration on why we need to always keep our scripture and read our scripture, but also read it with minds and ears to hear what's actually being said. It's one of those bloodthirsty stories. We all know it's common for people to say, I don't believe in the God of the Old Testament because that's the God of vengeance, and the God of the New Testament is God of love. And you can say, well, why would you say that? And then they point to the book of Joshua, right, where everybody, man, woman, and child, donkey, right, herds, everybody gets killed, and they're commanded to be killed. Well, I want you to know that if you were to lay Bronze Age stories side by side by side by side, that's the way they told things back then. Okay, time doesn't matter. Numbers don't matter. If they'll say it's an army of 100,000 were killed in the battlefield, no, they weren't. There weren't 100,000 of them. Time is in a wheel, not in a linear way. In other words, Bronze Age stories have a pattern, and these are Bronze Age stories. And so there's a strange story where God commands Saul to kill all the Amalekites, man, woman, and child. Got it. One of those stories that we need to do a little bit of digging and read with some thought. But then you, if you can understand it as that kind of story, then you can see the lesson. What he does is he kills everyone but the royal family. Because kings are special in Saul's mind, which means that Saul is not different in the way that God asked him to be different. A Hebrew king must be different than a Canaanite king. A Hebrew king must be different than a worldly king. But Saul proves that he's not different in this way. You know, there's a when the movie came out last year on Napoleon, I kind of got on Napoleon, and I'd been in Paris and just kind of got into Napoleon for a little while. And Napoleon did something really brilliant. When Napoleon made himself emperor, he really made it impossible to kill him. The reason why they had to send Napoleon to that island way off in the middle of nowhere after Waterloo, when they could finally get rid of him and not execute him, is because the crowned princes of Europe weren't going to kill another king. Once you sort of get back into that habit again, you start setting a precedent. And so the crowned heads of Europe thought they were special, more special than anybody else, and so they protected someone who was suddenly an emperor. And we see how well that turned out when World War I came around, when you've got families who are more special than others. I'm kind of an American Republican kind of guy that way. And so Declaration of Independence kind of guy. And so royals can be a danger. They can see themselves as above the law, if you will. And Saul saw himself as above God's commandment. God commanded him to do something, and he said, well, I'll do it for everybody but my kind. How about that? So God grieves that he's chosen Saul. And while Saul is still king, Saul sends Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint a new king, which is dangerous for Samuel because this is sedition. This is going to be a coup, if you will, one day that will actually take place when Saul dies in battle by his own hand, and then David has already been anointed king. So what happens is that Samuel goes to the house of Jesse the Bethlehemite. Jesse has 8 boys. They're fine, strapping boys, and the first 7 come before Samuel. And God says to Samuel each time, is this the one? Is this the one? It's in 1 Samuel. Let's see. I think it's in 1 Samuel 16. Let's turn to it really quickly. This is fun. 1 Samuel 16, page 226. The Lord said to Samuel, how long, since I've got you all coached up, it's fun to read these stories. We all know about them now. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. Bethlehem, by the way, means house of bread. House, lechem, bread, Bethlehemite. For I have provided myself a king among his sons. Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one that I name you. Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, do you come peaceably? Now remember, Samuel, before King Saul, was the leader of the nation. So his very presence is destabilizing and frightening. It's frightening for Samuel and frightening for them. He said, peaceably, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Okay, when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on his height or his stature, because I've rejected him. The Lord does not see as mortals see. They look by the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send him, bring him here. We will not sit down until he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel set off and went to Ramah, which is where he's from. Now, a couple points about this. First of all, we're told that David was little. And God looks upon the heart. Okay, here's a Bible club lesson. I teach all of them that God looks for people with big hearts. So you can be all grown up and important and professional, but God looks for your big heart. You have a big heart. Or you can be a little kid and have a big heart. And we try to teach our children to have big hearts. So just know that when your kids grow up at St. Luke's, we're all about big hearts. We're not about being the most popular or the fastest or the prettiest or whatever those things are. God looks at hearts. And so we want to make sure that their heart size gets as big as it can. And this is exactly what God saw in David. But then there's another word here that I find charming and provocative. And we're told that David had beautiful eyes and was ruddy. There is a church in Birmingham, Old Presbyterian Church. It does what a lot of churches do. It's the Mountain Brook Presbyterian Church on Jericho Road, which used to be an older building, and they moved it, and then they encapsulated it in a new building. So actually, when you go inside that building, it's a century-old church that was in Woodlawn or somewhere like that, and just got moved over there. So it's got old windows, and so old Victorian stained glass windows are really fun because you've got all the Bible characters, but they're all just as Anglo-Saxon as, most of us. And so they have a David depicted in there, and he's got little red hair, and he's ruddy. He looks like a little Irish schoolboy because he's ruddy, right? Got little freckles, just get ready to fight the giant because he's ruddy. Well, that's actually a King James translation of a word that Edon says, actually, the closest modern word he would say is that he was Arab. He's dark. He's dark-skinned. His great-grandmother was Ruth, who was from Moab, which is one of the traditional enemies of Israel. And when you read the genealogy, I guess it would be the genealogy, the one in Matthew, has Ruth and some other women in there. But Ruth makes the genealogy all the way to Jesus. So it's kind of neat that an outsider is included in the story of our salvation, because through David with his own big heart, like Samuel with his own big heart, would come, the story that would graft us into the story as well. Which is to say, to recap one more time, what does God want from us? Big hearts, like Samuel always had, like David always had, and as the story continues, the story of our salvation. I hope I've given you at least some context to figure out who Samuel is and what his point is in the Bible. I'm going to stop here and see if you've got any questions.